ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode number 322 of the Zombie Train. That means next week is a route review. I might have one or two routes lined up, but nothing is concrete at this point. If you want to get your route reviewed, contact me on Discord. Find the link to our Discord server in the Cargoes of the Terminus podcast. Anyway, this week we have a question from Michael de Villers, or Bucket Nation Railroader. He says, okay, this might be a very stupid question. I don't think it's that stupid. It's a lot of very. What is your procedure if an event like the CSX Crazy 8's Runaway and Unstoppable incident happened during World War Z? And there's actually a fairly... I had a conversation here, which is not something I normally do, but I can talk about very briefly the instances where things like that did happen, or at least the ones that I can remember most easily. The first being during just the regular zombie train, we had an incident with a runaway set of cars, which I talked about in this episode here, in number 258. Runaway trains, though, like runaway-powered trains. See, the thing is, there were a not insignificant number of people that did try to steal locomotives, make off with locomotives, like we did. That's why I hesitate to use the word steal, I guess. Don't want to feel like the bad guy, but that's what people did. I was one of them. I had better luck than most. We did, really. I can't take credit for it myself. So, we had better luck at, keeping our train under control than a lot of people did, because a number of people that stole trains, that took engines, at least, did not really know how to run an engine. Now, that's a hurdle for a lot of people, because to start up even a diesel isn't the most straightforward thing. It's certainly harder than getting in a car and just, click, vroom. It's a little bit more involved. So, a lot of people that tried to steal trains failed. But a lot of people succeeded because either trial and error or the engines were left running, which, as I'm sure many of us know or remember from before the war, happened a lot. Assuming that you were alive then. But, engines would typically be left idling, and all you would need was sometimes a reverser lever to get them going. Sometimes not. So, people could make off with engines. A lot of the time even I didn't really understand air brakes to begin with. So, that was a little bit of trial and error. I understood the basic principles. I didn't understand all the mechanics. As some discussion in this very video thread revealed, made me have to recall a lot of stuff that I haven't thought about in a number of years. So, there were a not insignificant number of runaway train incidents. That said, most of them, seeing one was rare. It would have been like seeing a traffic accident, You have to be in the right place at the right time, and the place and times were pretty spread out, and we were only ever in one place. At least during the zombie train times. And because a lot of the thefts happened right after the war began, mostly because it was people finding idling engines that hadn't yet run out of fuel, versus, engines that had been there. So the incidences of people stealing engines dropped off after the first, few days, couple weeks. Whenever engines ran out of fuel or, the area around them was vacated. If an engine didn't get taken fairly quickly, it wasn't ever gonna get taken. For the most part. Then there were the few left that either knew how to drive or knew how to start one or figured it out. And then, that lasted another stretch of time. And they would pop up from time to time. But the incidence of that, the amount that happened, was so little that being present for a runaway train scenario was astronomically small. The chances of it, I mean. And, well, unless we created it ourselves. So, we did once, and that was that. The Zombie Train Incorporated had slightly more problems with that, because we had some issues with engines running away, because something broke, your throttle linkage broke, and now your throttle is stuck open, for example. That happened, I think, twice. No brakes. That happened lots of times, especially when engines were running light, and they only had the independent to rely on, and the, and the brakes themselves were just worn out and broke. When you're using restored engines, it's tough to nail everything down, to make sure everything is as good as it's going to get, near perfect before you send an engine out on the road that might not return for service in in months or not, months and potentially years. Because God knows where this engine's going to end up. Especially in the early days, when there was a lot of undiscovered country, so to speak. When we would send an engine off to run a supply mission and say, basically, you guys have free reign. You need to get back here at some point, but if you find something along the way that's pressing, that's important, somebody that needs you, whatever, run it like we did. Run it like the Zombie Train. We would give our crews as much stuff as we thought they needed, based on our experience with the Zombie Train. We would give them all the tools and supplies that we thought they needed, or at the very least stuff to harvest what they needed from the world around them. And stuff to trade if they ran into people as well. Things like canned goods and stuff like that. We don't talk about the food supply very much. I mean, I've brought up the little farms and subsistence farming a couple of times in the past few episodes, but we don't talk about the lengths that we were able to reindustrialize food processing once we got a couple of years in. Once we had coal and a decent supply of metal, even though a lot of it was going to the engines and equipment. Once we had that and good sources for food, we started canning stuff. We started making, I guess the only word I can think of for it is hardtack. These rations, these, this bread-like stuff. I mean, we would ship flour places, but having these basic foodstuffs and then canned goods, which can last a long time if they're done right, which we didn't know how to make canned goods, so the first ones didn't. But that's neither here nor there. We were able to send engines out with supplies not just for themselves, not just for the crew, but for basically any small to moderate group of people that they ran across for differing lengths of time. The prerogative when you ran across another person out there was, well, A, figure out if they've been bitten, because we don't want to take somebody that's about to turn. And there's really no way to combat that unless they were just bitten, then maybe you can amputate the arm, for example, if it was in an arm. But if you get bitten in, like, the side or something, you're dead in, you're reanimated in 24 hours. So the only thing we could do at that point was, well, some people would just say put them out of their misery. Some people would say wait until they're dead, and then shoot them in the head. And that way they can't reanimate. Either way, really gruesome, not great, but those were the realities that we had to face. Those are the realities that still get faced, albeit very rarely, across the globe today. So, anyway, the whole thing with, sending these crews out, once you figured out if somebody was dead, or, going to turn, I should say, if they weren't, then the next step was to take them to either the nearest settlement, if they are okay. If they are injured or sick, then take them back to whatever the nearest major facility was. Most of our facilities were little self-contained towns, like I mentioned last episode, so we would have some sort of hospital on site, and if that couldn't do it, it was ship them off to the nearest military base. Or the front line, even. because they would have field hospitals there that could do generally more than we could. Anyway, unimportant, we're talking about Runaways. There were plenty of instances that were reported on of finding wrecks of trains. And the assumption always was it was somebody that stole the train and then crashed it. Generally that was the only answer that we could come up with. Engines don't tend to run away on their own, particularly not diesels. And zombies don't operate engines. So it would almost always have to be somebody who was running the engine, didn't know how to control it, or didn't know the track ahead and derailed, usually on a curve or something. Rarely there was some sort of defect with the track that had happened, and they didn't know about that and they crashed because there was a washout or something. Sometimes it was tough to tell what happened first. We do think we came across one train wreck that actually occurred before, just before the Great Panic, maybe the day before. And mostly because the guy was, still identifiable. He was dead, but he was A, not zombified, and B, still identifiable as a CSX crew member, the person that we found in the cab. There were, 2 people. I don't know what happened to the other one. I don't know if this guy was the engineer or the conductor. At least I can't remember. I assume it was probably not that obvious for us. The guy was not in great shape, of course. He died from the accident, or at least from his wounds shortly thereafter. And when we found him, he was decomposed. The only way we could tell he was, a human, or not a human, but a CSX employee. They were humans. That was a weird insinuation to accidentally make, that CSX employees weren't humans. Not what I meant. The assumption was because he was dressed up, or, he had his badge or name tag or whatever it was, he had some form of identification that labeled him as an employee, and not just as a random person that had stolen a train. Could have also been a random person that had stolen a train, but why would you keep that identification on you? Who's going to stop you if it's after the Great Panic? Pretty much everyone bailed on their jobs because of the Great Panic. Hence the name. So, that was a weird situation. Noteworthy enough that I remember it to today. That was during the zombie train. I think it was fairly early on. It was maybe within the first 6 months, maybe shortly thereafter. Again, the guy was fairly decomposed, but anyway. The Runaways that we had, we didn't have, during the course of the Zombie Train Incorporated at all, didn't have too many train wrecks. Did not have an absurd amount of train wrecks by any means, which is a godsend considering. Again, I attribute that mostly to the low number of trains we were running. We did have a couple of runaways turn into derailments, but typically the people that we had, because we sort of assumed that stuff was going to break, and we tried to train people to, what to do if your train starts running away. Of course, sometimes there's nothing you can do, but we did train people on alternative ways of stopping the train, or at least not getting yourself killed. There was at least one instance, to my knowledge, of somebody, a fireman-engineer pair, were the only people in the engine, and they were pulling a couple of cars. The grade was fairly steep. I don't know where this was. It was somewhere out west. I assume either near the Moffat Tunnel or thereabouts. And the engine lost its air compressor. That's what it was. That was another thing, that we had a lot of air compressor failures early on. They consume a surprising amount of oil, it turns out. And they bailed onto the hopper that was immediately behind them and the rest of the train uncoupled the engine and let it run away and applied the handbrake on the hopper and slowed down the rest of the train to the point where they didn't get killed. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you next week.